tell you that in the 1950s, all the way to the 1990s, a defense contractor, Lockheed Martin, had a research facility in the Arizona desert where they developed new jet fighters, the U-2, the SR-71, if you're a fan. And these are developed in high secrecy in this little shed called the Skunk Works. And to me, STEM Best has always been something of a skunk works for Iowa education. It's highly experimental. It's not very secretive, but we're trailblazing in a very similar way. Some of the models that have come out of this STEM Best are strikingly innovative, experimental, and edge-pushing, leading Iowa education by example. So with that, I welcome everybody to the webinar. Thank you, Tanya, for leading this project, Skunk Works of Iowa's Education System. And I can't wait to see what experimental models spring out of this year's cycle of proposals. So thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. Great introduction as always. And I just want to thank you again for joining us. And that Jeff alludes, this is really a series to focus on one of the many programs that the Governor's STEM Council offers, and that is STEM Best, Businesses Engaging Students and Teachers. And this is just one of the components of our STEM Best program is that it has a cost share stipulation associated with it. Many questions that we field from interested applicants and from our very own STEM Best programs have to deal with cost share and what it is. So in an effort to better inform and hopefully support those out there that are interested in becoming a STEM Best, which we hope there are many, we'd love for this opportunity to be in the hands of all students and businesses and educators throughout Iowa. We've put together this webinar for you today, and to share in his vast experience as an expert is our director here at the great University of Northern Iowa, Director of Research and Sponsored Programs, has graciously agreed to give us his insights and expertise on what cost share is Talif Hunt. So I will turn it over to you.
Okay, want to get the slides up? Perfect. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. Appreciate it. It's an honor to be here and to talk about the topic of cost share. I think if anyone on the webinar here has ever been confused about cost share, you are absolutely not alone. Here at the University of Northern Iowa, it's probably the single most discussed, most confused, most poorly understood element of grants writing, and in particular grant administration. And in fact, it's one of the things that regretfully, but I'll just tell you this because you're not alone, we struggle with day in and day out. People, it's just one of those things that's a little bit difficult to conceptualize. So what I'm going to do is just walk through, the basics of cost share, and try to introduce you essentially to the concept, how to think about it, and really how to frame your thinking about cost share, and then dive right into some specifics. And what I hope we are able to do is have some time for questions, and slow down as needed to field questions as they happen. And sometimes it's one of those things that is easiest to talk about through questions. So let's see if I can advance my slide here, but at first I have to find them. There it is. So again, Talif Hunt, Director of Research and Sponsored Programs here at University of Northern Iowa. I've left my contact information at the end of the slideshow, so feel free to follow up with questions with me directly if you like, but I'd actually encourage you more so to go through Tanya and the team at the Iowa Governor's STEM Council. They're going to be the experts on fielding questions about the STEM Best program itself. So I think that would be the best, but if there's specific elements about the presentation, happy to field an email or a quick phone call for some clarification. So cost share basics, we'll jump right in. First off, what I find most often is that the terms cost share get thrown around in a lot of different ways. And so when I'm going through, I'm just going to introduce, these are the things that I'm going to talk about, and it's not always a common language when it comes to research administration and the implementers and even the people who are administering the funds for you and giving you the funds. We often use some different language. So when I talk about the sponsor, I'm really going to be talking about the Iowa Governor's STEM Advisory Council, and in particular, the folks who are managing the STEM Best program. When I talk about, if I ever mention program officer, just know that that would be Tanya as your primary contact and the primary person administering the program. There's a lot of different people who go into the STEM Best agreements and programming. There's programming, there's the contracting, so it's a lot, but we'll just stay and keep it pretty simple and really just talk about the program officer in terms of your primary contact. Sponsored project, I'll throw that around a little bit. That's just your project and your proposed project at this point in time. If I talk about recipient or grantee, that would be you. That's you getting the project. Cost share. So if I slip on this one, Jeff, Tanya, hold me accountable.
Yes.
I will sometimes say match, and it's just the same thing. But so cost share and match are used interchangeably, and that's fine. But I have tried to just stick with cost share. I think it's more, it explains what is happening a little bit better than match. Sponsored, the sponsor share, sponsor costs, this is just essentially the grant funds. So those are the funds that are coming to you to spend on your project. And in the case of STEM Best, it's going to be half of the project costs that you're going to be able to spend on your project. So I find this very often. Sometimes people think that cost share is kind of funny money. It's something that you just kind of pull out of the air and you think, well, yeah, we want $20,000. Yeah, well, $20,000 in travel. How about that? And just kind of walk. Make no mistake, it's real dollars, and it has to be treated as such. These we'll talk about cash and in kind, and those are a little bit different. But once you've committed, as the slide says, once you've committed cost share and you've offered it, it becomes an obligation. And so don't definitely treat this just as you would the grant dollars that are coming in. One note, and this comes up a little bit later also, STEM Best program requires a 1-to-1 ratio. We'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, so how I always like to start is by talking about how you actually manage the funds themselves. In sponsored research administration, and that's essentially what you're getting into when you start administering grants and dealing with grant funds, there's an order of applicability for how you should always treat the funds that are coming in for grants, and the same rules apply to your cost share. And there's really 4 tiers of regulation applicability. The first tier is your institution's policy and procedures, and largely we're talking about financial policies, but it could be anything from HR policies to other types of policies of conduct. But for our discussion, we'll just focus in on the financial policies. So that's your purchasing, what would be something that your school or your home institution would allow as an expense or a purchase. That's your school's policies and procedures. Those always rule everything. You never break your own policies just because you've got a grant or a contract that's coming in. And then what you do is you layer the next 3 tiers on top of your institution's policies and procedures. Usually it goes state, local regulations, federal regulations, and then sponsor-specific rules. So one thing that I can point to that would be a sponsor-specific rule is it adds on to the rules and regulations. So a sponsor-specific rule, one that we can pick up, would be the STEM Best requirement for cost share, and the requirement that it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's nowhere in your school, state regulation, or federal regulations are you going to see that specific type of rule apply. That doesn't have, so that's an example of that tier 4. One thing I want to point out is that at no point can one of like a tier 2, 3, or 4 regulation force you to break your own policy. That never happens. So just because you have a federal grant, and I hear this from time to time, a good example is University of Northern Iowa right now has a international travel ban for the next 30 days. No staff or faculty can travel internationally right now for reasons you all are very aware of, I'm sure. I feel that 3 phone calls already saying, well, I've got a grant. So how does that work? I'm like, nope. Just because you have a grant doesn't mean that we can break that international travel ban. So just kind of an example there. So the reason why I bring this up is because it's really important to always visualize and approach grant funds as well as cost share in that order. Would you be allowed to spend the money according to your school's policies? If so, great. You can move forward, and generally it's going to be okay with your grant funds. But just because you have grant funds doesn't change your own school or home institution's policies. So the second slide on kind of how you should be framing cost share is to really understand what I call the 4 pillars of sponsored research administration. And this is a question to always ask you when you're thinking about cost share expenditures or when you're thinking about grant expenditures. Run through these. Is it an allowable cost? So was it in your budget? Is it a part of the award language? Has it been approved? Is it a cost that directly supports the project? Next one, is it allocable? So can you allocate this cost, this purchase, whether it's cost share or if it's grant funds, can you allocate that to the project? So is it something that directly supported the project? You wouldn't go out if you had a project to do a dump cleanup and then go and purchase a whole bunch of microscopes because you had the funds, right? Unless that was a part of the project. So you have to always think, well, can I allocate some or all of this cost to directly supporting that project? The next test is reasonable. So, and this one should be easy, but I always boil it down to, if you were making this purchase or expenditure, would you want to read about it in the paper? If so, if you'd be comfortable with that, it's probably okay. But think about that when you are not only making the purchases, but also when you're building your budget. So we'll get to this about how to value certain types of in-kind cost share, but think about the valuation that you're giving to certain activities. Good example, and one we'll focus in on a little bit more, is the value of volunteer time, right? So this one trips a lot of people up. And what you always want to come back to is when you're thinking about the valuation of that volunteer time is, of course, these 4 pillars: allowable, allocable, does the volunteer time go towards the project? Is it reasonable? Is the price you've given that per hour or that per unit volunteer time, could it withstand, some public scrutiny? And the other is be consistent. So if you have volunteers, for example, and they're all doing the same work, their per hour value should be the same if it's the same kind of work. So always be consistent. So allowable, allocable, reasonable, consistent. We'll probably come back to this a little bit, but important not only in the expenditures, but also when you're doing your budgeting and thinking about the different types of cost share. Okay, so building your budget and administering your budget when there's cost share involved is really important. And how I always like to approach the subject is frame your mind of you're building an entire project first. So you need to sit down, think about your whole project, and then you think about how much that's going to cost. And then for STEM Best program, you basically want to cut it in half, because half that project is going to have to be paid for by your cost share, and the other half, it can be paid for if you're successful through the grant funds. So as the slide shows, I always encourage, think about the whole pie, the whole project, and then think about what costs you can cost share, and then what costs you can't cost share because you need the grant money to come in to help fund half of that project. So a lot of times what I'm finding though, and so if you make this mistake, it's okay, but try to catch it early on in your budget building process or your administration, is folks will try to take the other approach. They'll think about all the special things they can do with their STEMBest dollars, and then kind of build like cost share kind of off to the side. Like, oh yeah, we've got to come up with cost share. And it becomes a secondary approach. Try to avoid this. I guarantee it will come back to bite you. You'll be running around in the last hours of your financial reporting period, struggling to find receipts for a box of napkins that you know you spent, and trying to call that cost share. I guarantee it'll happen if you don't take the right approach up front. So be aware. And so of course I'm using STEMBest maximum amount of dollars that they will award in the grant is $25,000. So what you want to do is think about, if you're going to try to ask for $25,000, you're building a $50,000 project first. All right, so next one, and maybe this goes without saying, but again, you're thinking one-to-one cost share. It's also called, oh, there I did it, even on the slide, 100% match. I knew I was going to come up. Oh, so that's all right. So anyways, 100% cost share. Match is the same thing, but 100% cost share. It's 50-50. So that goes for whether you're asking for $10,000 of grant, you're going to have to come up with $10,000 of cash match, or in-kind match, or cost share. And so this slide, I just would say, you know, you don't have to, of course, come up with $25,000 of cost share if you don't request $25,000. It's just a one-to-one cost share requirement. Okay, so this is where we're going to get a little bit deeper into the actual cost share basics and cost share itself. There's really two types of cost share. One is required. Talked about that a little bit. STEMBest requires a one-to-one cost share, and that just simply means that the minimum required amount of cost share is equal to the total amount of funding you're requesting. That's pretty simple. Believe me, that sometimes that trips people up, especially if it's not one-to-one. If it's 25% cost share, I see some pretty wild calculations going on sometimes. But simply put, in this very simple case, every dollar you want for a grant, you have to come up with $1 of cost share. There is this thing called voluntary cost share, and that's when cost share is not required, but still provided. Sometimes that happens. And applicable to this particular program, STEMBest, is if you were to offer more cost share than the grant dollars are coming in. That difference between the minimum, the amount of dollars that you have requested from the grant, the difference between that and how much cost share you're asking for above that minimum is voluntary. Not that important for us to get down into the weeds with. I bring this up because no matter what, as I said before, no matter what kind of cost share you offer, it becomes an obligation to the project. So most of the rules and regulations that govern cost share say once it's offered, it's obligated. That said, the programmatic people, so your program officer has a lot of latitude to decide how that cost share is reported, whether or not portions of it are going to be required. It's your program people, the program officer, who's going to be, and sponsor, and their rules and regulations that largely determine whether or not you might be held to something like voluntary cost share. But what I always discourage is, if you don't think you can do the cost share, then you better not offer it, right? Because it becomes an obligation. I've got a short example a little bit further in the slideshow. Okay, so you have the two categories. There's required cost share, voluntary cost share. And you can break those types of categories of cost share into really two types. And you can get really into the weeds here, but for our purposes of this presentation, we're really just talking about cash cost share and in-kind. And I think that there's a lot of confusion around what the difference is. And in fact, across the board, sponsor to sponsor, University of Northern Iowa has about $40 million in grants and contracts a year. We deal with about 230 different sponsors. And I think all 230 of them use different language and interchangeable language for cash and in-kind. And it can be really confusing because it's across the board. these terms are used interchangeably. Sometimes in-kind will be used to represent cash. Anyways, we'll sort this out for the purposes of how you should be framing it. But cash and in-kind cost share, both are allowable types of cost share for the STEM-BEST program. And then you can break it down to the cash or in-kind cost share that you, the grantee or recipient, are providing. And for this program, third-party cost share is also allowable. So we'll dig down in a little bit deeper. But third-party, just to set your frame of reference, would be your community partners for this program. It could be business, could be another nonprofit. These are just the community partners that you're working with. So in this case, they're called third party because the first party in the entire grant life history is the Iowa Governor's STEM Advisory Council and the STEM-BEST program. The second party to this equation is you, the grant recipient or the grantee. And then the third party become your community partners. Okay, so cost cash share. I always explain it as if it's something that you can spend money on and produce some sort of financial report or receipt or something. If money is exchanged, it's cash cost share. So some examples: salary, fringe benefits. Those are cash cost shares. Purchase materials and supplies, as long as they're specific for the project, those could be cash cost share as well. Equipment purchase for the project, travel to deliver the project. These are all potential cash cost shares. Now I get, sometimes I see a lot of individuals, faculty, staff here at UNI thinking about salary being some kind of in-kind because they're like, well, yeah, it's my donated time. But you have to remember, in the case of University of Northern Iowa, we're the recipient, we're the grantee, we're paying that faculty member to do the work on the project. We have a financial record that says for this amount of time, we paid you to work on this project, and we can prove that. So anytime you can demonstrate a financial transaction has taken place, it's cash cost share. So we'll get to it, some examples here in a minute, and we'll come back to this, but you could cost share your time spent on the project, working from your school. Others involved in the project could be, paraeducators, it could be who have directly helped out with the project. It could be your front office staff in this case, could be spending some of their time on helping to administer your grant project. Their time would be cash cost share.
Are you going to get into the $5,000 cap on equipment?
I was not, but the 5,000, that's usually just the threshold for what is a capital asset, according to the federal government. And I don't know if STEM-BEST has any restrictions related to the purchase of capital assets. I'm not aware of any, but
No.
okay. So that's the equipment. There is a difference between equipment. Maybe I'll just talk about it a little bit. Equipment and supplies and materials are different things, usually for a sponsored award. And supplies and materials are consumables, and equipment are purchases that are expected to have a lifespan that goes beyond the life of the project. So in this case, if you are buying something that was $5,000 or more and had a depreciable value that extended past a year, it would likely be equipment. So
I don't want to belabor this, but let's say some partner gave a STEM-BEST school a $3,000 microscope for this project. It wouldn't count as part of the cost share because it's under $5,000.
Not according to 2 CFR 200.
And we're bound by that.
No, you are not. You could make up your own rules for that one. Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only time the federal regulations truly apply are when federal funds are involved, and I tend to apply them. That's how we manage all of our projects here at UNI according to the federal standards. But yeah, you could definitely make up a different threshold, and many sponsors that we work with do.
Okay.
Okay, in-kind cost share. So in-kind cost share has a known and documentable value, but the actual, there was no actual financial transaction. So we'll get into some examples again, but this is something that you can place a value on. There's a lot of different methods to do that, but at no point during the project period did a transaction take place where two parties or more than two parties were exchanging currency, essentially. It's not that common actually for the institutions to have in-kind cost share of their own. So I should almost have clarified, it's not all that common for a grantee or a recipient to have in-kind cost share, because the recipient is the owner of the project, the funds are coming to that entity, and generally anything and everything they do should be allowable and, very key, allocable to the project, and it should generally have some sort of financial transaction that is associated with it. Now, there are some exceptions, and I'll just wait to the next slide to get to some of those exceptions. But I just wanted to kind of point that out. It's not a rule or anything, but most of the time, if you are the grant recipient, you are likely offering cash cost share of some sort versus in kind. Okay. So some examples of in-kind cost share could be waived rental fee, donated supplies, and volunteer time. So waived rental fee, this is a good example would be you're working with a community partner, the city has a nice venue, you want to use that for a couple of events. The city usually charges $50 a day. They waive that fee because you are an important part of the community and you're doing good things for your student participants. That waived fee has a value. It's $50. It is allowable to the project if you were to need to pay for that fee. It would be allocable because you're actually paying for it because you're hosting a STEMBest program with STEMBest students in it and community partners. It's reasonable because that's what the city has posted, and it's consistently applied. It should be consistently applied to everyone. Now, I see sometimes that this can be a little bit of a tripping hazard because there have been instances where I've run into where a community partner that offers to waive a fee for renting a venue, but there was never any fee to begin with. And they try to go through this kind of, bending of saying, well, it'd be worth about $100. If you find yourself in that situation, slow down and think about it. It really should have something, waived fees like this should have some tangible place where you could go look it up on the internet or have a costing sheet or something along those lines. But so again, it should be documentable. Donated supplies. So again, this is kind of akin to if you've ever donated to Goodwill or something like that. There's ways that you can assess a value to donated supplies. Sometimes it's really easy to take a supply, but it's sometimes not. Usually you're talking in-kind cost share for donated supplies when that supply has been fully depreciated. So if you think about the donation of microscopes, for example, if those microscopes were initially purchased, they've been around for a few years, they've got some age on them or they've been fully depreciated out, and those were donated, they have an in-kind value. There's no cash transaction that took place between the two parties that during the grant period that would make it a cash donation. But you might struggle to determine, well, what's the value of those, right? So there's some processes we'll go over to help guide you to that. But that would be a good example of a donated supply that is an in-kind cost share. Again, absence of a financial transaction. I'll just mention this. If the entity were to go out and buy the microscopes during the grant period and then donate them to the STEMBest program, that's a cash cost share, right? Because your third party contributor has a receipt and a financial record of that purchase. Volunteer time. So this one really trips folks up quite a few times. If you're using volunteer labor, just do an evaluation to make sure it is truly in kind, that somebody's not paying the bill for that individual to be at that meeting or to be at that mentorship program or whatever it is. If not, then you can use volunteer time. There's a couple of ways, we'll get to it. Volunteer time has to be consistent, meet all of the 4 pillars of sponsored research administration. What I would just make sure you're doing is, again, taking a look at the reasonableness. So I've seen where people, a small nonprofit doing a river cleanup, they had a lawyer show up and they needed to report cost share. So they're like, well, lawyers make $400 an hour. Well, $400 an hour is good for a lawyer, but people who clean up rivers, they don't get $400 an hour. They get like $20 an hour, something like that. So you can't say that. You have to match the value of your volunteer time to the activities of what that volunteer is doing. And one other thing is, so you as a grant recipient, you can never volunteer to do your job. So if you're implementing the STEMbest program as a part of your normal 100% teacher time, then you would always count that time spent as cash cost share. If you are a salaried staff person, so just keep that in mind. Nobody can ever volunteer to do their own job. So feels like we do sometimes, but that's not supposed to happen, right? So, okay, so just to clarify on the third party cash and in kind. So just like your institution can do cash cost share, and under some circumstances in kind, although it's a little bit more rare, your third party contributors, your community partners, all the same rules. They can contribute cash and in kind as well. So what happens is if you're a community partner, I'll just use the microscope example again. If within the period of performance of your grant, they go out and purchase some supplies and then hand them over so that you can use those, steel-toed boots or whatever it is, those have a cash transaction value that your third-party partner can actually document, and if audited, could then show the receipt through their own financial system to show that it's cash. Then same would go for if those microscopes had been purchased a long time ago, they're gathered up and provided as in kind because they're a donation, no financial transaction. It is up to the third party, your community partner, to assess the value. Now, they're going to have a hard time with that. I guarantee they're going to say, I don't know, what might be the value of this. I would encourage you to go jump right in and help them out. There's nothing wrong with providing them with resources or helping them decide, but ultimately they're the ones who are going to certify the value of that in-kind cost share. And so it's really important to have them make the ultimate decision on that evaluation. And that just is kind of the audit line of chain of command. Then what happens is, so what you need to do is get your third party cost share, whether it's cash or in kind, documented. And I've got one example at the end of the slideshow that I'll show you. Documented, have them certify it, and then you would gather that up and you would report that up to your STEMbest sponsor. On time, gotta get rolling. So a couple of examples of third-party cost share. Casey's donates some food for an event, right? So they have purchased it, but whether or not they purchased that during the grant period, it might not be as easy to determine, right? They could be using it as stock that was outside. So a lot of times, food, that kind of a contribution is generally treated as in kind. It's simpler for Casey's. It's easy. They can just point to the price tag or the barcode on it, and the price meets all of those 4 pillars of sponsored research administration marks. Business employees' time spent. So you have a STEMbest liaison. This person, part of their kind of company's contribution to your program is to have that person make his or herself available for a couple hours a week to do some work with students, something like that. That time, if they're salaried and meets some of those rules, would generally be a cash contribution, because the business is not forcing them to take vacation time or something like that to do it. It's time that's spent on that business's dime, so to speak. Travel, community partners to events, this could be cash or in kind. If they receive reimbursement from their employer or from you, the school, that's cash. If they just traveled in their own car, you could actually treat that as in kind. No transactions took place, but you could use, say, the federal reimbursement rate as an example for mileage as part of that cost share. Again, purchase items used for the project. We kind of talked about that with the purchase of microscopes during the grant period. That could be a cash contribution as well. Okay, so how do I value? This is one slide you might want to come back to. Cash, again, there has to be some sort of identifiable, documentable cash transaction that is taking place. In kind, there's a few different resources that you can use. One is there is an actual organization that keeps track of and values volunteer wages. It's called independentsector.org. If you get a copy of this presentation or just type that in, you'll go right there. I think the going rate right now, it's national. They break it down by state. I think Iowa's rate right now is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $23 an hour. That's a really safe thing to do. It's independently determined. It's determined by actual real rates. So it's something that you can go out and you can point to. Hey, if ever audited, this is how I came up with $23 an hour, is using independent sector. That's going to pass an audit flying colors because reliable, or it's consistent, reasonable, etc. You can use the Internal Revenue Service. They have a lovely, probably million-page guidance document on how to value the donation of goods. That's really going to be best for trying to value in-kind donations. Go back to the donation of your old clothes to Goodwill or something like that. There's also other resources like custom rates. So for if you're working the farming sector or something like that, ISU has a page. And what you want to look for is evidence that's been supported by research or another entity that would help value that research. There's, I hope it'll be made available to you. There's also a really good document called Valuing Volunteer Time by Henry Flood. It's dated 2001, but very much applicable, and it will help walk through some of the approaches that you can take to valuing cost share, in particular when we're talking about in-kind cost share. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip over the budgets a little bit, but this is just a sample budget sheet that I use for faculty and staff here at UNI. That we've got a lot of different variations, but what I'm just going to toss it up there is think about breaking it down as much as you possibly can. You'll never regret. It's a little bit more work, but breaking these types of costs down as far as you can to really be able to identify the costs themselves and decide how we're going to pay for that if we need to, or should we ask the grant for that. But really importantly, always thinking about your part of the budget and the match. 1 + 2, equals your total project cost. Always default back to that. So again, you'll be able to access the PowerPoint here, but think about, here's just some examples of the lead teacher and the teacher, that person's partner in implementing a program, their time. You might be able to, in this case, the UNI budget section is actually the sponsored cost, right? So that's the grant money that's coming in, and then the other part is the match. So you did it again, the cost share. And I've got it on this budget sheet too. Good catch. So you can see that we have a split between the sponsor and the cost share that you're promising. And again, you're just thinking about it. It's two sides of the same project overall budget. And I'll skip down to, I finished just a little bit more of the sample budget here. again, just showing some different types of ways to think about your cost share. So in this, I'm not actually breaking out the difference between cash and in kind, but in your budget justification, you should be thinking about this. You should be thinking about, for example, under the other direct costs, the room rental, that's a waived fee from the local bank who have a room, and they're offering it up. It's usually $300 a day. It's probably going to be an in-kind cost share situation from your third party. Consultants, we're going to ask the STEMbest folks to pay that consultant. Event volunteers, probably again like an in-kind. Doesn't matter so much in this particular budget setup, whether it's in-kind or cash, but keep track of it and address it in your budget justification as you're starting to put together your proposals. All right, some just about wrapped up here. Cost sharing rules. Again, cost share expenses, they must occur during the project period. Always, always. If it's, whether or not it's in kind and it's a donation, or if it is a cash transaction, whatever, one of those two, they both have to take place during the project period. Must be documentable somehow. We've talked a lot about that. Cost share always follows the same rules as grant expenses. So what's good for purchasing on the grant side is probably going to be okay as a cost share. That's one of those sponsor rules that can be a little variable, but in general, rule of thumb, that should be it. Cost share must be directly support the project. So again, unrelated activities, you can't just go out there and grab somebody's time or some kind of donation that was kind of helping the project. It should always be directly supporting the project. And again, here's just a little example of what we use for cost sharing summary worksheet here. Just, your source, little description, someplace where you could document the value. This kind of a form would be really nice because it has a certification section. So allowing all the parties to certify that cost share. All right, I've taken up a lot of time here getting through this, so I will go right ahead to the wrap up here and turn it over to Tanya. Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully that clarifies some things about cost share.
Well, are there any questions? Why don't we pause and just, I have a couple of things to tie it back, particularly to STEMbest, but are there any questions for Mr. Hunt?
You must have nailed it.
I think you covered, evidently you covered so much, nobody has any questions. Yeah. So very thorough, thank you. Yes. Just to kind of bring it around to a few things that for STEMbest and as our sponsor, and please feel free to chime in. When you are filling out an application as an interested party, you won't have to document on behalf of our sponsor what type of cost share you are providing. I think Mr. Hunt provided a lot of great insight, though, in looking at how you should be formulating that budget piece and looking at it as a whole as a $50,000 project and how you can account for those things. You should note that that budget piece is reviewed, and so you are scored upon that. So looking at it and through that lens, I would imagine would allow for a more comprehensive budget that will just come through in your application. So just so you know that. And also when you are formulating that budget, there is a narrative, and that's a great place to put in all those pieces that Mr. Hunt had suggested, because we're always very interested. The whole premise of BEST are those partnerships. So we want to hear how your partners are contributing, and a large part of what they do does have to do with how you will potentially meet that cost share requirement. And some things that we have seen as far as what are allowable for our perspective for cost share are the time that they are giving to you. You are reaching out to those partners to gain their insight about what their needs are within their particular industry. So anytime they are utilizing their time for planning or oversight of students, or perhaps you gave some great examples of space for you to utilize or equipment. Those are definite and allowable cost share when it comes to STEM Best. Anything that you want to add before I go to our final resources?
Well, you got me thinking real quickly.
Yes.
By the way, I finally understand cost share. Thank you.
Perfect.
I'm thinking about a case we had in the past where, timeline-wise, teachers and administrators are writing these proposals now,
Yep.
coming due in May. They're going to implement starting in August, September.
Mhm.
And all this is estimates. All this is conjecture. This is all hypothetical. I'm guessing I'm going to get cost share in this way and that way, and it's all guesstimates. If I'm an educator and I'm creating a BEST right now, and I'm working with a business partner crossing the street every other day saying, okay, let's work on this proposal. And the business partner says, well, I got a 3D printer. I'll give it to you right now. Should the teacher say, whoa, 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 don't give it to me now. Give it to me after I hear I got the award?
Absolutely. Yes, because that's one of our stipulations, is that the cost share has to occur within the grant period. And the grant period, it has to tie into your agreement, and you don't start that until you are actually awarded. So you have an award date and an end date. And so all of those, all of that cost share has to happen within that period. And we run into that quite a bit where, you know, you're talking to these partners now, and you're generating a lot of interest and excitement, which is great. And so that happens sometimes. They're like, oh, well, I want to do this. I know this is happening. And unfortunately, it just, if it happens before you're awarded, it's not allowable.
Good question.
So,
Really
yes.
good question, though. Yep,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good.
Any other questions before we close with final resources? Okay, so just to note, we have 63, we've been awarded 63 STEM Best programs, and we have 58 models across Iowa. This is a graphic representation of those models. And I always encourage anyone, you're a stone throws away, or now in this virtual realm, you know, phone call, email, Zoom away. They are gracious and willing partners and have gone through what you are potentially interested in going through. So utilize them as a resource. Find out what they have done. What did they use for cost share? Or what did they say, no, don't do that. That's not the best way. You got to do it this way. They are wonderful problem solvers and gracious partners. So please feel free to reach out to them. You can find specific contacts on our website, located right there for each program. And then, as well as, hopefully you are very familiar with our 6 STEM regions and the 6 superhero STEM regional managers that are affiliated with each region. They are your local and regional experts. So if you are not sure of who you should be contacting or partnering with it within your area because you're interested in bringing this opportunity to your community, your school district, feel free to reach out to your regional STEM manager, as well as Mr. Hunt has provided his information. If you have any other further questions for his presentation, or myself as the project coordinator, I have the gracious opportunity to help support the STEM Best program statewide. I am happy to follow up if you have any questions as it pertains to STEM Best and what you might be able to do, as the application window is open now and will be open until May 15th. Feel free to tune back in to our final STEM Best webinar on March 31st, how to navigate our online database system for an application submission. All of these webinar series are recorded, so if you have been overwhelmed by the amount of cost share information, feel free. You can view it again. So please feel free to access that, and thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Mr. Hunt, for giving us your time.
Pleasure. Thanks.